Welcome back to American Forum. Our guest in this episode is MichaelEricDyson, one of our nation's most brilliant and impassioned intellectuals with an especially resonant voice on issues of importance to African Americans. He has written a new book, The Black Presidency, Barack Obama and the Politics of Race in America. Not long ago, many of us had begun to believe that the election of a black president meant somehow that the deep racial divides in our country and our politics might finally be disappearing. Instead, after what feels like a wave of police shootings, angry responses from citizens, a horrifying white supremacist massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, a surge of racist rhetoric, and at times, a seeming impotence on the part of our president, Dyson's book arrives at a moment when the nation is as embroiled in racial unrest and disappointment as it has been in a generation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That was a really depressing intro that I just did.
Right.
Is it really as bad as that?
I think if we are honest about it, we'd have to say yes, pretty much. I think your kind of brief genealogy of the recent history of racial turmoil and trauma in this country is pretty accurate. We began with Barack Obama's election to believe, many did, that we're living in a post-racial society. Been there, done black. Over with it. And what happened, of course, is that Barack Obama, unexpectedly to some, just it evoked all of this racial animus and hostility. You mentioned Dylann Roof, the young white man who murdered 9 people in that Charleston church. He wrote a kind of crazed manifesto, and in it he said, "You people are taking over, basically. I have to do this." Well, only thing we've taken over completely is the prison industrial complex. We got a lock on that, so to speak. But what's interesting is that Barack Obama is an emblem and symbol of the rise of black power, not in the old school sense, but in the sense of exercising authority in a visible and public manner. And that has brought a lot of hostility across the board. I think many of the black people who have been assaulted by racial animus recently are urban proxies for Obama. Can't get to him, get to them. At the same time, I think that Barack Obama has been put into a box. He thinks it's a black box. He doesn't really want to be ghettoized to speak about race, but to see it that way is to miss an opportunity to lead from the bully pulpit that only the President of the United States occupies in this country.
And you're getting at something there that I think actually would be a surprise to a lot of Americans, even a lot of very thoughtful Americans, and that is that the assumption would be that a liberal-minded, progressive-minded African-American intellectual like you is an unadulterated fan of Barack Obama, the first black president, that you would have nothing to say except what a fantastic president he's been and to decry his critics.
Right.
But in reality, that's not an accurate depiction of you and a number of other folks who've said some similar things to you. But break that down for us, that you're not saying he's been the perfect president or the perfect African-American president, for sure.
Of course not. Now, let me begin by saying he's been an extraordinary president, to be sure. He came into office, the fiscal crisis was crazy. If the first black president allows the banks to fail, that's a headline you can't get over. Forget waiting for 4 years. He might not have made it to the next month. He can't let the ship of state go asunder because of its heavy financial weight. So he had to bail the banks out, which ultimately helped the nation's economy. He had the TARP, he had the recession money. He bailed out the automobile industry and put them back on the street, so to speak, and they're in full wheels. He also gave us health care, all this in the first year or two of his administration, which is rather extraordinary. And then he's faced obstruction, the likes of which we've never seen. Even with heavy fueled, obstructions of presidents in the past, nobody's faced quite what Obama has faced because of that racial layer that's on top of all of that. So I appreciate him. I appreciate his swag, his style, his charisma, his ability to code switch, all of that. He's a beautiful man and a remarkable human being. So he will, I think, in my estimation, go down as one of the greatest presidents we've ever had, but race will not earn him that plaudit. His dealing with race has been lamentable in many ways. On the one hand, he's felt like, look, if I say something about race, it just sets people a Twitter and I can never get over it. He says that the police acted stupidly. with Henry Louis Gates when they arrested him in his own home. Yeah, pretty much they did. But when he said that, it set off a firestorm, a week's worth of conversation about black people in the criminal justice system. And he had to eventually have what we dubbed a beer summit to bring Sergeant Crowley, the arresting officer of Professor Gates and Joe Biden, the vice president, to a beer summit. Well, the thing is, he learned a wrong lesson, I think. His lesson was, hey, don't speak about race, because if you do that, it's radioactive and it's toxic. Well, is that any different than when you talk about, I don't know, anything else? Anything you talk about, President Obama, is pretty radioactive, especially to the right wing. So I think that he learned the wrong lesson. He was reticent. In fact, he practiced racial procrastination. Put it off. Let's not do it right now. Not say something very obvious. Even in his last State of the Union, going out the door, it's your Hail Mary. It's your swan song. You can pretty much say what you want to say within the confines and parameters of etiquette and so on. Not a mention of Black Lives Matter, which he has on occasion spoken about and quite eloquently. No mention of the prison industrial complex, no mention of police brutality, no mention of citizens of this country, the vast majority of whom supported him, and the problems that they confront. That is unacceptable, because if the price of admission is the denial of our voices once our bodies get in, the price of admission for his presidency cannot be that we are not allowed to speak about with intelligence and skill the issues of race that he has written about brilliantly. It's like having Michael Jordan in the White House and he can't talk basketball. Really? I mean, you wrote a book, Dreams from My Father, which explored beautifully biracialism, black solidarity, the division between black power movements and civil rights, and you talk brilliantly about what the future of this nation was in your own body, and yet now you've ascended to the heights of power and you have very little to give to us. I think he has failed us in that regard. Us not only being African American people, he's failed the nation to push them, to encourage them to deal with an issue, not in a way that he has to raise his hand and come out the White House painted red, black, and green. Although on the last day, if he wants to do that, I'll be there with him going, Rafiki Wakuumba. So
dashiki in place.
Dashiki in place, afro, maybe a gold grill, saying, hey, I live in public housing and I've been a black man doing it for 8 years, I'm out. But beyond that, simply to deal interestingly and intelligently with the issue of race is what he is supposed to do. He didn't want to be a different president than any others. Well, guess what? LBJ is not a black man, spoke about race. Richard Nixon had to deal with the issue of affirmative action. Every president has had to confront it in serious and reflective fashion, some in reactionary fashion, but they've had to deal with it and not avoid it. He can't get a pass because he's a black man for that issue.
I think if he would say, or some proxy of his would say, first, when I was running for president in 2008,
right,
I was already making it pretty clear that I wanted to be the president of everybody. I wanted to be this uniter, and that he viewed that as an important transition for the country.
Sure.
In the same way that Hillary Clinton has struggled with whether to be seeking to be the first woman president or to just be another president.
Right.
And President Obama struggled with and navigated that issue in those same ways. And I think the defense on all this fronts would also be that while he hasn't talked a great deal on a day-to-day basis about race,
sure,
he's done these programs, some of which you referred to, that have been of benefit to African Americans.
Right.
And then at the same time, and I just want to get your reaction to all these thoughts, he has spoken about race periodically, and sometimes in these quite eloquent ways, as after the terrible massacre in Charleston.
Absolutely.
And the speech he gave in Selma, and some of those things you write about in the book.
Sure.
But I think the sense of what you're saying about much of his presidency is that those things are insufficient.
Right. Well, yeah, you laid them out. Let's take them one by one if I can remember them. So first of all, when he's talking about, I want to be the president of all Americans. Hey, I want you to be the president of all Americans too, including African American people. I'm arguing you haven't been the president of all Americans. You've excluded African American people from the most serious central consideration you might yield. For instance, when he says to black people, I'm not the president of Black America only. Well, yeah, we didn't think you were the head of the NAACP. We figured that you were the president for everybody, including me. So including us, including African American people. That means, you weren't the president of gay and lesbian people when you pushed same-sex marriage brilliantly and courageously, when you withstood, even from your own flanks, attacks and assaults, people questioning theologically, whether or not you failed within the rubric of Christianity. You stood tall and proud. You weren't the president of gay and lesbian America. You weren't the president of, if you will, Jewish Americans when you stood against America going to the United Nations Conference on Racism because it singled Israel out for some very harsh criticism. You weren't the president of the environmentalists alone, so I can tick off many things that he's spoken specifically to those interests. So I'm saying, why is it that he can speak to all of those interests, but not African American people? Now, the obvious question is, because he's black. He's not gay, he's not Jewish, he may be an environmentalist, but he's not part of the very groups that he can claim to be organically linked to and therefore giving them some kind of leg up. I understand that concern, but again, if African American people are American citizens, you may not be the president of Black Americans, but you are the president of Black America, but you are the president of Black Americans. We are citizens. And the interests that African Americans have are part of the American interest. We are the largest constituency that supported him both times, 96%, I think, in the election in 2008, and then maybe, I think, 93% the following election. Not a bad drop off there. So the point is that Barack Obama has enjoyed and has pursued the black electorate through various channels in subtle ways. I know I was there. I was part of the people who supported him, and vigorously so. So that won't work. That won't wash. And when you talk about, and I've said this to the president face to face in the White House, his approach is, a rising tide lifts all boats. I can't be specifically aimed toward black people. Targeted policies don't work. I believe in the universal. I said, Mr. President, when you go to the emergency ward, you don't get medicine. If you have a hangnail, you get aspirin. If you have diabetes, you get insulin. If you have cancer, you get chemotherapy. Medicine is targeted and works best when it targets the illness that is in the body. So I think that his own philosophical outlook in regard to social transformation and public policy muted the concern of race. And he used to echo William Julius Wilson, the great sociologist from Harvard, but even Wilson changed his mind and said, you know what, I no longer believe that. You got to target it, you got to speak specifically about poverty and the like. So that's it. In terms of the programs he's done, look, that's great, but when you stand before America and offer a charitable interpretation of black men's futures, the response to police brutality is my brother's keeper? So let me get this right. You're the president who has public policy in his panoply. It can use executive orders. We know maybe the Supreme Court will reject what he did with immigration and the like, but he made an executive order about that and one in regard to gun control. So it seems to me that when it comes to the president, black people get charity, not justice. Martin Luther King Jr. said charity is not as good as justice. Charity in the sense of my brother's keeper doesn't address the fact that disproportionate numbers of white police who are white men are murdering without legal redress or moral compunction or killing unarmed black people, men and women. That has to be addressed through public policies. Now, to a degree, when the president talks about his congealing of interest around the police and the like and his commission, that's great. But at the end of the day, I think that he's got to address this issue in a way that's forthright. And thirdly, yes, he's spoken brilliantly at points about race when he's been pushed. I mean, Trayvon Martin, what did he give first? A little press release. It's been decided that we are a nation of laws. That is tone deaf. For a man who was a brilliant orator, who stood at the feet of Jeremiah Wright for 20 years, good, bad, and ugly, or whatever people think, but one of the most brilliant orators in the history of this black church in America, Jeremiah Wright was. He heard that. He heard other brilliant preachers. He's a gifted preacher and orator himself. Not official preacher, but a preacher of the sort of the gospel of American democracy. Barack Obama has been forced mostly into those issues in his speeches, and certainly not enough. The last year, much better than what he did before, but there was an evolution, and we have to be honest about that.
And what would, very quickly, what would an executive action that he could have taken that would have somehow been meaningful to you in this regard? What might that have been?
Well, look, you can talk about the very interest of America in regard to policing is to say, people have to live in the neighborhoods that they police, all right? In terms of actual recognizable policies, right? People who live in Delaware go over to police people in Baltimore, we get the Freddie Gray situation. People living outside of Ferguson may come to Ferguson. So it seems to me that one executive order could be that when a prosecutor is engaged in reflecting on whether or not to send a case to the grand jury, that the protocol be that we have a special prosecutor, the way Cuomo mandated in New York, and to put forth, at least from the Justice Department, a strong argument that such a measure should be adapted locally. There's no federal intervention in the name of this concern without local recognition, and so I'm not silly about that. But there's something that the president could do to suggest that this is a serious issue and that prosecutors who work with police people are not likely to put them to the test in terms of being put before a jury, and many other things. But those, if we're talking about police brutality, the mandating of cameras was a very good thing in terms of the commission. But as we saw in Chicago, they go to Burger King, take the camera, the footage is gone, and what goes? Yeah. Same thing can happen with the body cameras.
And certainly the president could have, and maybe we'll get to this in a minute, but the president certainly could have much sooner done some of the things that now are underway in terms of mass incarceration and some of the early release programs. But I want to ask you about the relationship between the president and black Americans, in a sense. When I was at the Wall Street Journal, I covered the 2008 campaign, and back in those days, you didn't know me, you wouldn't return my calls. But
I told my assistant to talk you, man. I don't know what happened. I'm about to call my mother and ask her what happened.
But after President Obama was elected, I think at the 100-day point of the administration, we did a bunch of stories about the first 100 days, and I wrote a piece about what I was sensing of the sentiment among a lot of African American intellectuals and thought leaders of there beginning to be some frustration about these very things. Talked to a whole bunch of folks. I don't think I talked to you seriously, but while there was a sense of this frustration, it was generally off the record or on background, and what everybody wanted to say on the record was essentially, well, we have to give him time, we have to be patient, all those kinds of things. You write in the book at one point, you say, if Obama's delivery on race is sad and disappointing, the failure of most black Americans to hold him accountable is no less. Who are you talking about, and what are you talking about when you say that?
I'm talking about the masses of black people. Look, there's a reason that the masses of black people love Obama, because white America has had 43 presidents, and black people have had one. Now, many white brothers and sisters remind me, he's half us. Okay, so we've had 43 and a half white guys and half a brother in the White House. The reality is that black people are understandably protective of him. And why not? The man has received disproportionate amounts of threats, incredible disrespect. What other president had to have a congressman from Charleston say, you lie, in session of Congress, of both houses as he speaks, the president? What other president has had Jan Brewer, the governor of Arizona, put her finger in his face like he's a little boy? What other president has been called a boy by two presidential candidates recently on the Republican side? And on and on and on. A cipher, a monkey, a black box, the things he's been called, he and Mrs. Obama, have been extraordinary. And he's an incredibly cool customer to be able to deal with that. And so black people say, not only give him time, but the man is doing an impossible job with impossible circumstances, all of which I'm sympathetic to. But the problem is that not only has he spoken about race when pushed to do so, he has spoken about race, but mostly in the negative toward African American people. He has scolded black America. He has chided black Americans. And my point is this: if you know you can't do that to white people, because you can't, because they're not going to tolerate that, because you don't have the bona fides, even if you are half white, you're not perceived that way. He tried it at a Sony fundraiser in San Francisco when he tried to say, some white people get bitter and cling to guns. Oh, he was reproved very swiftly in the press and no longer approached that. That was a boundary that was drawn that Obama recognized. So I'm going, cool. If you recognize you can't say that about white brothers and sisters, don't say the stuff about black people in public. The kind of moral stuff. Pull up your pants, don't feed your kids chicken. And then, when he goes to graduation ceremonies where he's the commencement speaker at a historically black college like Morehouse, He's telling them about, making no excuses. Sir, they haven't made any excuses. They're graduating. Or, you're not going to get what you don't deserve, what you haven't worked for, what you haven't earned. The only person that day who didn't earn their degree was you, Mr. President. You got an honorary degree. So what's interesting is that he scolded us, and I was not there, but I was at the Congressional Black Caucus when he told them, stop complaining, stop grumbling, take off your bedroom slippers and put on your combat boots. Sir, when you were knee-high to a tadpole in 1961 when you were born, these people were on the front lines doing serious things like John Lewis and the like. So I think it has been the level of disrespect that President Obama has shown that many black people won't even recognize, fail to acknowledge for obvious reasons. To think that the person that you worked so hard to put in office has harbored such negative sentiments toward you would be something difficult to abide psychologically. And plus, black people hear it all the time. It's not like they don't hear what Obama's saying, those kind of stern chidings. We heard it from Bill Cosby.
And how did that turn out? Yes.
Yeah. How'd that work for you?
Yeah, the politics of respectability. But those are also things, though, that I wondered about this as I read your passages that dealt with this very thing. And there were so many people, you and others, who were very incensed, particularly by that one commencement speech you gave at Morehouse, the most elite institution for black males, arguably, at least according to Morehouse men. Right. And that sense that how of all the places that these things could be invoked, how could they be invoked here?
Right.
There was a tone deafness to that was striking. But you also describe an experience in the book. You have been around President Obama a good bit. You've interviewed him in the Oval Office. Sure. You describe at one point being with a gathering of other African American intellectuals and such in the Roosevelt Room, I think, in the White House.
Yes.
And at some point the president says, and it's really directed at you, says, I'm willing to take criticism, argue with me about policy, but what I can't stand are critics who question my blackness.
Right.
Which is the very thing you were just jokingly doing. But
not in that. See, he was talking about, really, he's probably talking about Cornel West, and he might have been talking about Tabbits, because he knew that I made a distinction between public policies. I don't question his blackness. He's as black as a man that we've produced, especially behind the scenes. I mean, people who know Barack Obama, let me give you an example. So we were out politicking and campaigning. In the first campaign, we were in Cincinnati. And my wife was famously supporting Hillary Clinton, and I was supporting Barack Obama. Many a night I spent on the couch looking at President Obama on my television.
Complicated.
Yeah, that was a Facebook complicated relationship. So one day Obama tells his photographer, he said, come here. He said, Mike, come here. He tells the photographer, come over. He says, take a picture of this. Obama throws up the victory sign with me saying that. He says, now send this to your wife and show her what a real winner looks like. So he talks trash, not just on the basketball court. And the many tropes and ideals of blackness that he embodies smoothly and effortlessly, I would never challenge his blackness. What I would challenge is the application of his own bully pulpit to black people, his internal if you will, reprovals and scoldings of black people, and the failure to make the vast majority of Americans aware of some of the issues that confront black people. Now, when forced to, he does. But here's the problem. Most black folk have not wanted those of us who have been inclined to force him to do so. And Obama has said, presidents only do what they're forced to do. And he said this to Wolf Blitzer when he was being interviewed. He said, who would Dr. King endorse among you? He said, nobody. What Dr. King would do was get the people together and have them hold us accountable. Well, isn't that interesting? Obama said it. If we try to do it, that's a problem. Now, let me be honest. I mentioned, one person at least who has been quite nasty and vituperative and bitter. I don't get down with that. I think that's wrong. I think the personal assaults upon the president from the left or right, from black or right are wrong.
And you're talking about Cornel West.
Of course. And the reality is that kind of bitter, assaultive speech, and I addressed it at length in a profile I wrote for the New Republic, where I took him to task because I think he needed to be taken to task. And Obama has been in an incredibly difficult situation. So even those of us who recognize he's been in an incredibly difficult situation still have to hold him accountable. And I think black Americans have been disinclined to do so because they think of it as either or. That either we support him, ride or die, or he will be vulnerable to rebuff by right-wing critics who have no such conscience when it comes to distinguishing the stuff he's done well and the stuff he hasn't done so well. And I understand that, but at the end of the day, my job and responsibility as a cultural critic and as an African-American participant in the political drama of our times is to tell the truth as best I can with as much fierceness and eloquence, balance and compassion, but also to tell that truth to create a situation where we can reflect honestly about what we're confronting.
In a kind of counterintuitive way, is it possible that the fact that the criticism that you have had, a version of the criticism that someone like Cornel West, who the two of you have famously sparred over the past year about all this, someone like Frederick Harris, who wrote one of the early books that raised a lot of doubts, an African-American writer who sat in that chair not that long ago, talking about these things, but that these criticisms, these substantive criticisms of the president, in addition to the fact that in both of the past elections, there has at least briefly been a black Republican candidate who was very high in the polls, regardless of what everyone thinks of Carson, or that Herman Cain is the emptiest empty vessel in all of time. But regardless of those realities, nonetheless, does all that's the fact that really brilliant African Americans like you are critical of the president, and the Republicans actually at times are quite supportive of African American candidates for president, does that suggest that at least some portion of the negative sentiment toward President Obama is not just driven by race? I mean, it's not what drives you.
Oh, sure, of course not. I would never conclude that, all of that sentiment has been driven by race. There are legitimate concerns and criticisms that can be put forth across the board. But here's the point. So much of the animus, however, has been driven by race when it didn't need to be. When Barack Obama did not have automatically the debt ceiling raised like any other president, Democrat or Republican, what are we to conclude but why is he the only one? Did he come up with some super duper democratic idealism, an ideological spell that he waved with his magic wand and cast upon people that the Republicans thought had to be opposed? No. The fact is that unconsciously and sometimes consciously, Barack Obama's race, even when he has insisted that it not become part of the discussion, has come in for the discussion, so to speak, and has been used as the implicit backdrop of that discussion and has colored people's perceptions of who he is. When the Tea Party stood in the streets and held up signs and placards that were referring to his ethnicity and what country he was from and being a witch doctor and the like, I mean, come on, that's pretty racially driven. And so I think that, yes, there are many legitimate ways to criticize Obama, but there is also the case that so much of the animus toward him has been coupled with race. For instance, the Tea Party says, look, we're against big deficits. We don't want a lot of tinkering with the Constitution. And we don't want people who are trying to put forth their ideals without acknowledging the checks and balances. Well, why weren't you mad at, George Bush? Why didn't the Tea Party come into existence then? So I think there's a definite racial animus that is at play here, whether we speak of it or not. And I think that Barack Obama has done his level best to try to resist the kind of self-pitying response. He's been quite remarkable in that regard, avoiding the trope, the metaphor, the symbol of the angry black man. Unfair, because Donald Trump can be as angry as he wants to be. Ted Cruz can be as angry as he wants to be. Marco Rubio, but Barack Obama has to be very careful. So he signifies. He goes before Congress, says, I don't have any more elections to run. A couple of State of the Unions ago, and the Republicans are giving him guff, and he says, yeah, that's because I beat both of you. Now, if I was his anger translation, because I whipped both of you, boy, I could engage in some more colorful language to interpret him, but this is a family show. So the reality is that Barack Obama has been in an incredibly difficult fix. And I think that, yes, there have been some opening up of possibilities as a result of that criticism, but I don't think principled criticism of Obama has led to Cain or Carson, the two C's, that have arisen on the other side, 999, and then Dr. Carson as a neurosurgeon, I think have gone the way of all flesh, perhaps. But I think that, again, to say, hey, we put forth a black person who's not cut from the cloth of the primary sentiments of most black people. So you get outliers within the community to say they're representative of the entire community. that kind of ruse racially is pretty obvious to most black people. So no, it doesn't have to simply be about race. It can be about ideology and politics, and those together with race make for a very lethal cocktail.
Part of of what has gone on around the politicking of conservatives and Tea Party in particular, one of the other ironies, really, of this period of time has been that I don't think it's unfair to say that the Republican Party, the conventional Republican Party, the now profoundly threatened conventional Republican Party, really had no meaningful initiative or intentions around attracting African American voters for a very long time. To the degree that it wanted to, it just couldn't pull it off. And then, but we have seen some activity around the idea of making a conservative case to African Americans in the last few years, and it's primarily come from Tea Party type folks and libertarians. That kind of fits, I think, actually with what you were just saying. But one of the messages in all of that has gotten some currency at times has been this claim that African Americans are on a new plantation. That's the language. And that plantation is the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party owns black Americans. And there are a lot of black voters and black folks out there who will express frustration that at times, why don't we just keep voting for these Democrats? What are we getting out of it? It's kind of a version of what you're saying. But does the Democratic Party, by and large, own African Americans?
Wow, Massa Clinton. Massa Obama. Massa Obama would be an interesting improvement, wouldn't it? Although if you read Larry Koger's book, you know, a certain percentage of black people also owned slaves. So that wouldn't even exempt President Obama. No, I think that, you know, the only time it seems to me the right wing or conservatives want to bring up slavery is to indict somebody else, not to be self-critical. There's enough slave stuff in your history and tradition and past, my brothers and sisters on the right, not to have to look far afield. The metaphor works for them, but they said that, you know, I think it was Ben Carson, that Obamacare is the worst thing since slavery, the Affordable Care Act and so on. So they tossed that slavery metaphor around pretty loosely. I think it doesn't fit, it's inaccurate. I don't think, now, that doesn't mean that black people are not dissatisfied with being taken for granted.
Yeah, that's go for the substance of that.
Right.
Is there a kind of unnatural or unfortunate or whatever the right adjective would be of that, and maybe it's just that African Americans have, by and large, have the sense they have no other recourse.
Well, what other recourse do they have? That's a great point. See, so the point is, we could, you know, Bernie Sanders is surging in the race now, and people think, well, that's a powerful recourse. But, you know, what's interesting, when he was asked the question about reparations and so on, and Ta-Nehisi Coates recently wrote a piece in The Atlantic taking him to task, that is Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders, he's saying, Bernie Sanders said, well, reparations is too divisive. You're a democratic socialist. Is that not divisive right there? Oh yeah, that's going to ring big time in Kansas. So what's interesting is the fact that Bernie Sanders, even the patron saint of the left, finds an interest in a specific excavation of a terrain in American culture around the issue of race and slavery too radioactive, too problematic. So even if the far left finds it problematic, what choices do black people have but to work with what you got? And, you know, we can say, yes, we're dissatisfied with what's going on in the Democratic Party, but dadgum, does that mean we run into the arms of the right wing, which has shown no manifest ability to, A, be sensitive to the interests of African American people? Recent outreaches have been interesting. They did an autopsy 3 years ago in the Republican Party, although most of their candidates have ignored it. Reince Priebus may be discouraged by that, but the reality is that you don't run into the arms of people who are further away from a sense of you know, engagement with your issues, because the people closest to you have failed to do so. So you engage in constructive critique. You engage in serious resistance. The Black Lives Matter movement says we will not be partisan. In that sense, we will hold everybody's feet to the fire and hold politicians accountable, and to a degree that has worked both with Clinton and Sanders in terms of putting these issues, pushing these issues to the forefront. But yeah, there's some legitimate disgruntlement with what's going on. But you know, all relationships have disgruntlement. You know, you don't just leave at the first sign, although we've been married for a long time to the Democratic Party, at least since FDR. And there's been, I think, progressive disgruntlement and arguing about, are there alternatives? Was there a third party? Can we go the Green Party? Can we do a black political party? None of those things have really worked. So black people are, by situation, coerced into a relationship with the Democrats, but also using and leveraging that position to demand some issues be put on the agenda that otherwise would not be there.
And your man Cornel West, who is considerably further to the left, even of Bernie Sanders, is his man. Is his race man, exactly.
Yeah, no doubt.
All very interesting. Boy, what a complicated mix we live in this country.
Yes.
I want to come in a second. I want to talk about where you go toward the end of the book. But before we do that, President Obama will soon not be President Obama, or not be in the office.
I'm gonna miss him. I'm gonna miss him, man.
But he's a very young man. He's 54 years old.
Yeah.
If in fact he has stopped smoking and continues to not smoke, then the odds are he's going to be around for certainly 30 years, maybe 40 years, maybe much longer than that. He leaves office. In fact, certainly as soon as he leaves office, he'll be among the most popular figures in American life. I think there's almost no doubt about that, because there's no longer any political currency to despise him for the most part. And so all of that changes. The historic nature of his presidency, whether you disagreed with him or not, just the first black president and this congenial person, that alone gives him a position on the American landscape that's quite remarkable. And he's going to be around and presumably incredibly influential.
Yes.
What do you expect of this person who, regardless of anything you've said, is almost certainly going to have tremendous influence over what is this incredibly important central body of voters to the Democratic Party? I mean, is he a kind of quasi-president for the next generation or two?
Yeah, the thing he said he wasn't, the president of Black America, he might become. So, not a bad second job. You know, Martin Luther King Jr. had it, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton. I don't know if they want to share Sharpton with Obama, but Obama is extremely beloved. Will be much more than a president of black people de facto, so to speak. But he will be extremely well-loved and well-regarded across the board.
But does he become a kingmaker in the way that Bill Clinton tried to become a kingmaker, but could not quite accomplish?
I think so. I think that, look, his influence is huge, or as Donald Trump would say, huge. You know, I think that he will be there working with My Brother's Keeper, working with charitable organizations, and maybe a bit more frisky ideologically and politically than he could be in office. We'll see a different side of Obama, dare I say a blacker side of Obama, where he can signify a little bit more. He's still going to keep it within reason. He's still cool. But that cool aesthetic will be imbued with a sense of freedom that allows the vocalization of some sentiments and passions that he couldn't quite make or didn't see his way to make in the White House. I think he's going to be a hugely influential figure. He may be a kingmaker in terms of anointing the next one, whether that's the person running for the president or the Senate and so on. His voice will be heard, his influence will be felt, and I suspect that many of us will miss him being there, because what I've said is out of love. I love the man as a human being and love him as a political figure who's represented so much of a tremendous interest to us. I just am disappointed that he chose to spend so much of his capital excoriating the very people who loved him. We're your girlfriend, but when you see other people coming, you don't hold our hand. That's not cool. That's not good. And it doesn't feel good when we especially have publicly loved you. And this is what I always wanted Obama to feel. You know, at the White House, at the public housing, at the crib. Man, if they're doing this to me, what in the hell are they doing to ordinary black people, right? They don't need me in the bully pulpit beating down on them. I'm not a substitute father figure for them in that way, a paternalistic, condescending, nagging, finger-wagging shrew. I am the embodiment of their ideals and aspirations, and even when they fail, they project onto my thin shoulders a burden that historically I must bear. And I wish he might have come to that earlier. We haven't heard much of that scolding recently because people like myself and others have spoken back to him and said, stop it. And there's a better way to do it, and disagreed with him. Whether he agrees with that or not, it stopped. And let's be honest, the racial terror that was unleashed in this country made him realize if black people are dying in churches where they let anybody in because we take the gospel seriously, then maybe I ought to lighten up. Maybe I ought to stop the kind of that kind of finger pointing that does no good ultimately, and instead use my position to ennoble the American quest for democracy and to strengthen the resolve of America to listen to the interests of legitimate citizens who happen to be African American. So at the end of the day, love the guy, support him tremendously, but also think he needs to be subject to principled scrutiny and criticism.
As you come toward the end of the book, which is chronological for the most part, you do make this fairly remarkable turn. It's all about these kinds of things that
Yes.
you've been talking about. And then you credit him, in large part, attached to the events around, I mean, your narrative is built
Right.
around the events at Emmanuel Baptist Church in
Right.
Charleston, South Carolina, and the brilliant speech that he gave.
AME Church.
AME, sorry. And the brilliant speech that he made there. But then finally you write at the very end of the book, after accepting that some very significant thing has happened, you say, the promise of his black presidency beamed as brightly as it ever had.
Yes.
So how on earth did we get from where you were just a minute ago to the bright, beaming promise of his presidency?
Well, it was a moment. Right? So it was a luminous moment.
It was not salvation, it was a visit to the
It
church.
was a visit to the church, and it was important, and to tell that truth, because then in your State of the Union, no mention. So are you quarantining black conscience? Are you quarantining concern about social justice to the black church and the moment it occurs with the Confederate flag and joining with Nikki Haley and joining with Lindsey Graham there? Is there no purchase beyond those spectacular moments? You might embody and model for us a concern about race when there's not a crisis, when we can talk about it as a flow of things, in the flow of things. And I think that Obama missed yet another opportunity at the State of the Union to talk intelligently without crisis in the backdrop. Immediately, there's a crisis going on ongoing in terms of black people and the police in this country, and in terms of poverty and radical inequality. But I'm saying without a kind of racial terror event looming large, he might have said to us, this is the part of the everyday fabric, the woof and warp of what it means to deal and address the issue of race. We don't have to be pushed there by a crisis every time. Let's calmly and reasonably and rationally address this issue. So Obama might have said, for instance, at the State of the Union, you know what? A group of citizens who happen to be African American are subject to practices and problems that should be pointed out, that should be uprooted, that we should address. That's worth a line or two. That's worth a tear too. The black people who have died, who have suffered, who are American citizens, and your existential anxiety and personal wish to be clinically distanced from that for obvious reasons. You didn't want to be ghettoized, you didn't want to be blackened in the inappropriate fashion, but you were blackened nonetheless. And none of your reaching out across the aisle to the right wing worked. None of your outreach to Republican brothers and sisters worked. And you finally had to acknowledge that you've got to do what you got to do. Well, black people were always there, will always be there, have always been there. And as a result of that, there was an exploitative dimension to that. And I think that Obama needs to be called on that. And at the same time, we got there because we had principled criticism, pushback, saying, no, that's not right. Expressing without bitterness or rancor, but vigor and some aggression that this is the matter, these are the stakes, and you must behave in a particular kind of fashion. That's how we got to that last sentence of that last chapter, where I talk about him being free to be at his best when he was blackest. That's a freedom he didn't often have. And then to allow the luminous principles of democracy to converge with the sentiments and passions of black people. Martin Luther King Jr. said, it may be the Negro, quoting Arnold Toynbee, who will inject new meaning into the civilization, the veins of American society, of this country, and redeem it. And Obama was the living proof that that was possible, but he seemed to deny the source from which that inspiration came too often. And that's why we arrived there. But that's why I take the reader on a journey in this book, from where he was to where he is now, and what the potential loss of his choices have been.
It does feel like that in the months since you had to step away from the typewriter, that maybe some of a sense of optimism that you were feeling as you finished that book has dissipated to some degree.
Well, it's you know what, Rhino Niebuhr said, optimism is a shallow virtue, but hope is deeper. So I'm hopeful in the same way that Kendrick Lamar is. to quote another great philosopher. He says, look, if God got us, I don't care what we're up against, everything's going to be all right. I'm an ordained Baptist minister. I believe in that ultimate principle of hope, but it doesn't ignore the nastiness that is afoot. So it's a dynamic tension or a continuum, to mix metaphors. So for me, Obama, slides along that continuum. At the Emmanuel Church, it was a high point both for him personally, for his presidency, and for the American nation in grappling with a heated and hated symbol of racial animus that finally was unfurled under Obama and came down. And I think that those kinds of moments should be encouraged. But of course, he's back and forth. I didn't expect the White House, as they did when the Supreme Court decision regarding same-sex marriage was announced, to show the rainbow colors at the White House, right? I'm not saying let the rainbow colors of black affiliation or Black Lives Matter come forward on the White House, but I am saying that symbolic outreach to valued and hurt constituencies is no less meaningful when applied to African American people, the people, after all, who above all others have supported you in such vigorous and vocal and visible manner. They deserve better often than what the president has given to them.
We've only got a few more minutes to talk, and there are a couple of other things I really want to hear you on. And one is to step away a moment from President Obama, because your book's not just about that; it's about the politics of race. It's about America. But there was another quote that Dr. King was fond of, borrowing from Gandhi, in which he said that nonviolent civil disobedience is only effective when the oppressor loves the oppressed. It is challenging that the love between these two parties, that then nonviolent civil disobedience actually has an effect, opens the eyes of the oppressor. Ta-Nehisi Coates, another brilliant young African-American writer, recently written a very big book, very popular book, but ends in a profoundly bleak way, from my reading, a real sense of that, a kind of hopelessness about whether the bridges, these broken bridges in American life, can ever really be built or rebuilt. But what's your bottom line view? I mean, do the oppressors, to borrow the language, do the oppressors love the oppressed enough in America for this wound to be healed?
Yeah, that's a powerful question you raised there. And Ta-Nehisi Coates' book is extraordinary and rich and powerful. And one can disagree with, the ultimate conclusion. That is to say, he does tell his son, you got to keep fighting on, because fighting is important. Those in African-American religious traditions, and I'm glad as an atheist he's articulated his viewpoint, because it needs to be, that is, the black church perspective, criticized, and vigorously so. And I think his is a powerful counterposition and a powerful counter-narrative. But ultimately, I'm still, as many theologians have talked about, Jürgen Moltmann and others, a prisoner of hope. So in that sense, I'm hopeful, and hope against hope. I never used to understand it. Hope against hope. What does that mean? That means even when there's no evident reason to hope, there is something you've got to pull upon. And that is the history and tradition of black struggle against white supremacy, social injustice, economic inequality, the oppressor loving the oppressed. We might say, where's the love? We don't feel it. At the same time, Martin Luther King Jr. understood that you had to love the hell out of the oppressor. That what he did was, he understood love not only as a political machination, but a strategy socially, and an existential projection of the self, but he understood it as the basic way of survival in this country without committing a prolonged form of suicide. And Martin Luther King Jr. grasped hold of that, depressed him, struggled against white supremacy, killed him ultimately, but what he invested in is something that we are the legatees of. That hopefulness that will not die, that in the face of the most bitter form of resistance, what is more bitter than losing your life in a church at prayer meeting because of your openness and taking the Bible seriously? Be careful to keep strangers out, lest you entertain angels unaware. This young white man exploited the humanity of the black people that he denied by killing them. The very raison d'etre that fueled his hate-filled crime was repudiated by the love he saw, and it almost stopped him. He says, I had second thoughts. Well, black love creates second thoughts for white supremacy, for social injustice, but also uses it as a metaphor to deal with other isms, other forms of oppression, because it must be race and sexual orientation. Black people can't hold on to the same Bible that was used against us to then justify homophobia. Well, that's different because gay people chose to be gay and I'm black by birth. Okay, so when did you choose to be heterosexual? 9 years old, you said, hey, mama, I'm gonna need a black book and a fast car because I'm about to holler at these ladies. That's not how it goes, right? So people inherit vocabularies, understandings of the world, and it teaches us to be a bit more sympathetic and empathetic to those who struggle with their own white privilege and whiteness and against the stream of white supremacy to become who they are. I mean, everybody can't be Douglas Blackman, the most loved white man in black America, maybe besides Bill Clinton, but you know, you might be taking Bill's throne, I don't know. You might be taking Bill's throne, you know. You and Bill Maher, y'all might be the people. So the reality is that, you know, we've got to figure out the principle and practice of love as a social diagnosis whose answer it is, and as a way to push forward beyond one's own disbelief in one's own abilities to overcome. Martin Luther King Jr. said, you can doubt, but you can't ultimately lose hope, because if you do that, you lose perspective in life. So yes, my ultimate answer still swings toward that, you know, tradition of love and response to hate with love. And love, as Dr. King said, not that namby-pamby, you know, no disrespect to the king of pop, we are the world, you know, kumbaya moment. It's about serious, on-the-ground engagement with evil in its face and the refusal to see to it the ultimate priority or the ability to determine what we are as human beings. And in that sense, I'm down with the King tradition.
And it is a powerful thing to remember, particularly this time of year when we think so much about Dr. King and his work, that the two things that we've just been talking about. One, that when Dylann Roof went into that church, he was encountering probably the only people who loved him in his world. This derelict soul.
Yes.
And he counted on that one day the first people who loved him in a very long time, and then he killed them, and the horror of that. But also that Dr. King in the end, and this speaks in a way to some of the things you've said about President Obama, I think. Dr. King, in the end, saved white people as much or more than he did black people. And that's an often misunderstood thing, but it's through the power of that love. I want to ask you one last thing. Something that we are doing here at the Miller Center over the course of the next year is talking to a lot of people about one very simple question, and that is that we do have a new president coming. Odds are it's not going to be an African-American president. But we have all these issues swirling around us in the country right now. They will confront the new president immediately. And so whoever this may be, whichever party, man or woman, if you were sitting down with that next president immediately after the inauguration and you had 10 minutes, or let's make it 1 minute, you had 1 minute to say, this is what you must do to address these things in a way that perhaps President Obama hasn't. What would that one thing be?
And very quickly, and probably given the fact of white privilege in this sense, probably couldn't. You know, Bill Clinton had more permission to be black in public than Obama does. Why? Because he could play the sax on our Arsenio Hall show and Obama couldn't. So I would say the first and most important thing, deal with the issue of police brutality against African American people. You know, push for special prosecutors to be appointed anytime a police involved shooting occurs. And then ultimately deal with the reform of the prison industrial complex in this nation, where people who go to jail for nonviolent drug offenses must be put on a different track than those who commit serious crime. Those are the kind of things I would speak to immediately.
Yours is an extraordinary American voice.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.
Michael Eric Dyson, the author of The Black Presidency. I think I said that wrong, didn't I? No, I got it right. Let's try that again. Let's roll that back.
3, 2.
Michael Eric Dyson, the author of The Black Presidency, arriving in bookstores this month, February 2016. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
This is a terrible outro. I became so emotional.
That's all right. I love that.
There we go.
I love that.
All right.
3, 2.
Michael Eric Dyson, the author of The Black Presidency, arriving in bookstores this month, February 2016. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you'll join the conversation with American Forum on the Miller Center Facebook page or by following us on Twitter at Douglas Blackman or at American Forum TV or at Michael E. Dyson. To send us a comment about this program or download podcasts or transcripts, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next week. Great. All good.
Okay. What's up, man?
Best applause we've had in a long time.